Welcome again, ladies and gentlemen. Thank God for the day He has given us. Another beautiful day. Today, there is nothing that gives me so much pleasure knowing that many of you have watched this channel and continue to grow with us as we continue to bring you different topics, different sharing topics, but also give me a lot of feedback on things we have shared with you. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we continue to thank you for your support. We welcome you back. Don't forget to share and subscribe. As we promise you all the time, today I have great pleasure of hosting an amazing person, transformational leader, a person I've known for many, many years. Call her my love. I call her my sister, call her my mentor. I call her my colleague. We've worked together for so many years, supporting Nyaka, the organization I started in Uganda, supporting grandmothers and children who are orphaned because of HIV/AIDS. She's a fighter. She is an activist. She is an advocate. She's a human rights lawyer. Ladies and gentlemen, you are going to meet Ilana Landsberg-Lewis. Ilana, my friend, welcome, and please give us a little background about you.
With pleasure, Jackson, and thank you. That is the most generous introduction I've had in a long time, and I'm overwhelmed with love and admiration too, because you know that we have stood in solidarity for many, many years, and the passion that brings us to the different pieces of work that we have done. So it is a joy to be in your presence again. And I guess just in terms of a brief introduction, I started out in my younger years as a human rights and labor lawyer. And that was really motivated by a passion. I never intended to be a lawyer or to practice law, but a passion for social justice. And something that my grandfather had said to me when I was quite young. And he said, you know, the end will never justify the means, but the means will always shape the ends.
Is this your maternal grandmother or
it's my paternal? It's my paternal. And
yeah, Lewis, the man.
Yeah, his father, who was one of the founders of the equivalent of the Labour Party in Canada, and was also a labor lawyer when in his younger years. And he said this to me, and he said, if you want to understand how power is preserved and how it operates, you should at some point understand the law. That is how privilege and power gets deeply embedded into the fabric of society and can often be very, very opaque to those who don't have access to it. So I never forgot that. And it really shaped a lot of my life, that and growing up in a family that was engaged in the promotion of women's rights and feminism and social justice. And so I went to law school and I studied law, and I practiced for a very short time. And then I realized that I had so much more to learn, and that the practice of law was not so much the direction I was going to go into, but using the law and the understanding of power and systemic power and structures to be an advocate. And then I spent almost a decade working at UNIFEM, which is now UN Women, in the United Nations system, and realized there too that kind of systemic response, much as there are many things that are very important about it, was not going to be my way. And I learned an enormous amount. But mostly what I learned was the tenacity, the intelligence, the determination, the extraordinary courage of human rights defenders at the community level, at the societal level, and how those of us who were working in systems of so-called support, which, were not amplifying their expertise and their voices, were not affecting a shift in the paradigm of the structure of north-south, of donor dynamics, of where the money was flowing, as if that conferred upon those who had it some kind of knowledge, some kind of entitlement to decide how things should move, how things should be done. All of it really never listening to the imperatives, the wisdom, the lived experiential intelligence and sophistication of those working at community level to meet the needs of community the world over, and particularly in the global south because of the disparities historically that had been fashioned. And so I realized that was one of my greatest learnings. I was being sent by the UN to go and do human rights training or to be involved in different projects in different parts of the world and much in sub-Saharan Africa, and realized that I was learning so much more than I had to offer, and that there was some kind of cognitive dissonance, some kind of disconnect between the understanding of what an expert looked like and who an expert was. And my law degree, my Canadian status, my where I came from, my privilege and my own power as who I am, my location, also as a settler in Canada, that all of these things had contributed to some kind of entitlement around being called an expert, whereas the people I was meeting at community level were far greater experts than I. So that led to an awareness in the moment around the AIDS crisis unfolding on the continent of Africa. And at that time, my father, Stephen, as you mentioned, Jackson had been appointed by Secretary General Kofi Annan as a special representative on HIV and AIDS, a special envoy on HIV and AIDS in Africa. And I was hearing from him the absolute despair in the negligence and the extraordinarily slow response on the part of the international community to what was happening around HIV and AIDS in the continent. And at the same time, traveling around the continent, seeing the extraordinary efforts at community level, without any support, with no financial support, without policy support, without any drugs at the time, without access to proper health care, because all of it had been impoverished over millennia by different forces, as we know. And none of it was flowing, and let alone trickling down. And so we decided, our family has no means, but we decided that something must be done to get funds directly into the hands of community-based organizations without the red tape, without the bureaucracy, without the imposition of strings and conditionalities and everything else. And our job was just going to be to raise those funds and to engage in a serious sort of with mutuality and respect for the expertise of community-based organizations. And that gave birth to the Stephen Lewis Foundation and what is now almost the 20th anniversary of the foundation. I'm no longer at the helm of that foundation. I was in a leadership position with colleagues for 17 years. Yes. And I'm sure that's what we'll talk about in this conversation. So there you go. That's the intro.
Thank you for that background. Let me ask you something. Why did you decide to become a human rights activist? You've done so much work over the years. You worked at United Nations. We've had so many conversations when we've met in person in Toronto and all over the world at different conferences. Please share with our audience why you decided to become a human rights activist.
Jackson, that's a good question. No one's ever asked me that. I don't know if I'm a human rights activist. I think I have supported so many human rights activists and defenders through, or tried to support that work. But I was very fortunate, Jackson. I grew up in the bosom of a family. I always say I was breastfed on the intolerance for injustice. The world is starting to wake up now to the realization that the systems that we, and I mean this globally, the systems that we have, whether you believed in them or you didn't, the systems that have been supported for so long have failed to improve the human condition, have contributed to so many different layers of oppression and marginalization and silencing and disparities in the world. And I think that there is no greater work in life than to figure out, wherever you are, whether you want to work in healthcare, whether you want to work as a social worker, whether you're interested, no matter what field you're interested in, even if you're an accountant, whatever it is that speaks to you, that you're doing in life, that there is no greater way to be part of the human family, I guess that's the best way to put it, than to figure out what is your contribution. What contribution can you make to the improvement of the human condition? What role can you play? And figuring out that role, I think, can be it can be simple in terms of just going and getting engaged with issues that you care about, whether it's climate justice, whether it's women's rights, whether it's children's rights. But I think we recognize now more and more that this phrase that Kimberly Crenshaw brought to life for all of us, intersectionality, that this has many dimensions of potence and importance in our world. And increasingly we see the intersections of all of these different systems and of all of the different ways in which human rights have to be integrated and lifted up, and very much finding our position within that is a critical piece of being part of the world, and not just legacy, what we leave behind or what we hand to the next generation, but how we ourselves live our life with purpose, with meaning, and in a way that goes beyond ourselves. And I think, Jackson, when you asked the question about why go beyond the comfort of your own country, the comfort of your own context, I think that's part of the answer to that, right? Which we understand now, the connections across continents, and how one part of the world has a deep and lasting impact on the other. I think it's time for the impact to be reversed. I'll finish the answer to the question in this way. I have learned, I've been extraordinarily privileged in my life to have the gift of learning from so many activists, advocates, determined community members who just will not stand by and watch the injustices, the suffering continue in their own context, whatever it is. And I realized that it was going to be my life's work to find a place of respect where I was not taking up spaces that were not mine, not stepping into places that were not mine to speak about, but standing in solidarity with, learning from it, acknowledging those who actually are making a difference in people's lives every day.
Ilana, my friend, do you think the HIV/AIDS battle will be won in the next 30 years? Conversations have happened over the years. Conferences have been attended. Your dad worked at United Nations as Undersecretary under Kofi Annan. You worked under Women, the Convention of Women and Women's Rights at United Nations. Both of you got together and started Stephen Lewis Foundation, which has supported Nyaka since its inception to this day, the longest supporting foundation of Nyaka. Do you think the HIV/AIDS battle will be won in the next 30 years?
I honestly do not know. I don't know. I think that sometimes when we try to stimulate momentum, excitement to the end of a terrible scourge, a terrible plague, I always wonder if that's how we really should be talking about it. Or we think, of course we want to eradicate HIV and AIDS. Of course, that is a goal that we all share, that is close to our hearts. I think for me, the question is not, will we do it by this date? But more thinking through from a human perspective, what is it going to mean? In the days that come, whenever they are, Jackson, that there is either the kind of treatment or the kind of far-reaching access or a cure, whatever it is that emerges in the times to come. There are still many deep questions that have to be answered and work that has to be done. There is the trauma of decades of loss, the trauma of decades of inequality of access to proper healthcare and healthcare systems. There are children, and you have been responsible for so many of them and cared for so many of them, generations of children now who have grown up without parents. Grandmothers, gogos, yayas, jajas who have grown up themselves, who have raised these children and with great sacrifice and huge hardship. So the echoes, the ripples, the emotional resilience that is being built now at community level by so many organizations like Nyaka and Rotom and Reach Out and others, these will have far-reaching ramifications in the lives of generations of people. We know that to be true. And there's so many lessons to be learned as well from all of the community-based organizations who have worked for decades now with such tenacity, such decency, such sophistication around the intersection of HIV and AIDS and tuberculosis, and HIV and AIDS and age and youth and malaria. I mean, there is so much that has been learned. These learnings, this understanding of the role of community in meeting these apocalypses, these calamities, are tremendously important. We know just from what we're living through now, what we've been living through around COVID, how the community-based organizations rose to meet the challenge of COVID and HIV. So I think when we talk about the end of AIDS and of HIV and AIDS, of course, this is what we're all working toward. I think there are so many lessons when we look at what happened with COVID around the hoarding of vaccines in the North, how the vaccines were delivered and not delivered to the global South. We have so much to learn from how the AIDS pandemic unfolded in Africa, what the responses have been, what they have not been, what the communities have done to meet those challenges in spite of the lack of the response, the lack of the funding, and I think that, much has changed over time. And there has been much progress. But I worry about these racing to the finish line kinds of statements, not because I'm not looking forward to the end of HIV and AIDS, not because I hope that it won't be 30 years, it'll be 20, but that I worry about the conversation that we have to have about the inequities, the inequalities, the disparities in power and in the flow of capital and in the investment and in the respect for those who have the urgency and the expertise in Africa at community level. That is the conversation we have to be having at the very same time that we're talking about the end of AIDS. Why aren't we closer to providing universal access to the kind of healthcare for the older women, for the grandmothers and the go-go's who are raising legions of children orphaned by AIDS? Why are they still fighting for eyeglasses, for healthcare, for access to information? These are things that are not about the end of AIDS. This is about the negligence, I would say, even the delinquency of the response to AIDS in the early years, that still we fall short for the Global Fund for AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria. Every single year, we celebrate the amount of money that has been given to the Global Fund as if it's some wonderful achievement because it's all of this money, when we know, every single one of us knows that that is not the amount of money that will meet the challenge. It is not adequate to just celebrate what advances have been made or to make governments feel good about themselves in the hopes that they will continue to support. We have to also acknowledge that not enough is being done. And so much of the burden is being left to those human rights defenders, those community champions, those ordinary people who have risen and taken the position of those who will not allow their communities, their families, their children, their grandchildren to die because nobody else has recognized what they know to be true about the long journey to build resilience and recapture life for everybody.
Yes, my friend, that's right. You also must have personal core values that you have stood by all this time. Please do tell us what they are and what our audience can learn from them.
Well, let me speak specifically to our special relationship over almost 20, well, it is 20 years now, Jackson. And I think and that is really the sort of the way we came together through your work at NYACA and my work at the Stephen Lewis Foundation. One of the core values that I have learned and continue to learn, really continue to learn, is that this project of this piece around philanthropy, this piece around donors, this piece of work, this kind of landscape of donors. One of my core values is this deep commitment to listening and learning, and I think the truth is I'm going to plug in my computer while I speak to you. The truth is that, Jackson, is that there's a piece around, there is an aspect to the work that requires an enormous humility. That is hard won, and it's hard work, and you have to be vigilant every single day. A humility around your position when you're working within the philanthropic universe of organizations. And I think that humility there's a lot that we can perform around that humility, but to integrate it deep into your soul, into your heart, into your frameworks, into your lens, is work that you have to be vigilant at. And I want to say something very honest to you, because I'm older now and I've had time to reflect and think.
Oh,
I'm not a youngster. I'm not a youngster anymore. I never did all of that work myself. This is not me being humble. The kind of humility I'm talking about is the kind of humility where we recognize our position. So as somebody who's white, who's North American, who's privileged, who has been to law school, who worked within UN, your location, what that means, what that brings to the work, the lens that you bring to the work, the way that systems of oppression, discrimination, racism, homophobia, misogyny, the way that those systems, in whatever way you have benefited, that I have benefited from them, they're deeply embedded on a cellular level, and you have to I have to spend my entire life, every single day, being vigilant about not defaulting to thinking that those are, or to making those invisible. And to be very honest, because I think it's important to be candid about these dynamics, that I have made more mistakes than I can count. I have, on a personal level, professionally, in terms of dynamics, in terms of the work, in terms of trying to work with decency, mutuality, thinking about how to do it with respect, thinking about how not to become an expert myself about lived realities that are not mine, about working within a diverse workplace, not just the culture in the workplace of the Steve Lewis Foundation, but broadly within relationships with all of our partners, recognizing the power disparities, being in the position of founder, the daughter of the person whose name is on the door, not that we had the money ourselves, but still his name on the door, my name too. All of these pieces around power and privilege, disparities, things that we work very hard to be good people. We don't like to think of ourselves, those of us who work in this field, as people who wield that power, who abuse that power, who actually have the luxury to not even see it when it's in operation, right? I have to be honest that I see so many ways over the decades that I have failed the people around me, or failed the people that I lived to serve and work with. I didn't do any of this on my own. Every core value, every realization I've had, Jackson, really comes from learning from others, and learning that no matter how deeply you hold your principles, how you live them is a challenge. And we all have to think about the position that we sit in and what we hold as we live those values. The principles on paper are in our heads that I could articulate, principles of mutuality, of respect, of feminist equality, of thinking about all of that, of anti-racism and anti-oppression, of white supremacy, of anti-colonialism, all of the things that we think about now with much more intentionality. There's much more attention being paid to it. That no matter how many of those principles I articulate, this is a lifelong vigilance that must be kept, and acknowledging the positions of power and disparity as you live and manifest those principles you believe in is the only way to dismantle them. And at the end of all of it, there are some of us who will not be the ones who dismantle it. We are just in the position of privilege and power, and we are going to have to hand the power and hand the funds and hand all of it over to those who will dismantle it. And that is a process of learning and humbling oneself, and not seeing oneself at the center of the narrative, or even at the center of the action. And Jackson, it has taken me many years to be able to articulate this in a way, and I know have not arrived yet at where I want to be. But so my core principles and values are really nowadays, and this is a more political piece, but it's summed up this way. You know how lately there's been a lot of talk about trust philanthropy,
Oh my God, yes.
Yeah. So the philanthropists and the foundations have to trust the partners more, trust them to know what they're doing, throw away these northern-based private sector imports of metrics and results and outcomes and outputs, as if the approach to improving the human condition is not about well-being and a holistic approach to well-being. And this was always at the core principle of the foundation's ideological approach to supporting and standing in solidarity with partners. But I'll tell you this about trust philanthropy. I keep thinking this. I'll share it with you as a friend, and I know you'll have people listening, and people can disagree. It's always good to have debate. I think that even trust philanthropy reinforces colonialism and the phrase of it. It reinforces a kind of colonial north-south. It reinforces some of that white supremacy that infuses capitalism and donor relations. Why does it do it? Because we're still putting the donor at the center of the conversation. The donors should be more trusting, trust philanthropy, trust-based philanthropy. But what I believe, and this is about myself as someone who perpetuates these systems, as well as trying to just be a good ally in solidarity with those who are trying to dismantle them. So I don't absolve myself of this either. Actually, the trust is the trust that philanthropy and foundations have to earn back from those who are doing the real work at community level. Actually, it's the whole system of philanthropy and foundations and donors has broken the trust over and over, abused and broken the trust of our partners, of so-called beneficiaries. Even the language tells us how philanthropy has seen it. So really, when we think about trust-based philanthropy, and I'm saying this from the personal place of having perpetuated some of this too and fought against it, we have to think about trust-based philanthropy as the philanthropists and the foundations and the donors being deserving of the trust of the community-based organizations. We have to earn back and deserve the trust of those partners who are actually the experts on what needs to be done and what is real impact. And we need to be listening to them, and we need to earn their trust back, rather than our trusting them and somehow changing some of the systems around reporting or around metrics or whatever it is. I think that even the phraseology puts us still at the center, puts people like me, at least even when I was in the foundation or in a position of being a donor or an ally, at the center of the conversation, that it's my trust that matters, as opposed to it's the trust of those doing the real work, like NIACA and all the other community-based organizations, whether it's fighting gender-based violence, whether it's working on HIV and AIDS at community level. That trust has been broken, and it has to be re-earned. So I would turn it around, and I think that's something I think about a lot, Jackson. How do we all keep turning it around so that we hold ourselves accountable? And that is my lifelong work. And I promise you, I have not achieved it as well as I wanted in life. So I'm still on the road.
Ilana, my friend, many people would like to follow in your footsteps. What advice would you give to those who would like to follow in your footsteps?
Well, you said beautiful, Nicholas, and my boys. We're so proud of all of them. And this is what I'd say, it's something you said earlier. Before we started recording, we were talking, and it's an experience that you and I have, that we share, that so many people come to us, especially now that we're not 30 anymore. People who our peers are in their 50s, right? And they come to us, and this happened throughout my life at the foundation. But I think as I get older, I appreciate the lesson more. People come to me all the time and say, I have made money, I've got the position, I have my home, I have whatever it is, the cars, whatever it is that represents success in the capitalist context, and that most people accept that this is successful, to have this secure life with lots of resources, financial resources, and often a title or a very successful position in a law firm or in whatever company you're working in. But throughout my years, how many people have come to me and said, I feel like something is missing. I'm not fulfilled. I've got all of this. I don't want to leave my position, or I'm thinking of retiring, whatever it is, whatever stage of life they're in. And they say, I want to sometimes they use different ways of putting it. They want to give back. They want to make sure that they leave something behind. They want to, but all of it is infused by a sense of urgency before their life is out, to do something that has deep meaning, that gives them a sense of purpose, and that gives them a sense that they've done something beyond themselves and their own comfort and their own security for their own family. So what I say to young people always is that it's a false economy. It is a false economy to look at the metrics of success of a life and think that having money and having fame and having a title and having seniority and having all that power, it is a false economy to believe. And that's not to say that these people don't have souls, don't have hearts, don't have good lives, don't have all sorts of meaning and can't be good family people. This is not in any way to disparage anyone's life. It's just to say that we have to remember that these benchmarks of what we call success, these hallmarks, are not a substitute for a different kind of meaning. They are not. I don't know how else to put it except to say that it's a false economy of what constitutes a successful life. The successful life, not everyone has to devote themselves to improving the human condition. Not everyone has to devote themselves to the kind of lives and passions that we have, Jackson, but everybody, and I do believe this, every single soul on this planet must find a way to do something more beyond themselves. Because until and unless they do, they will not feel that it was a life well lived. And I'm not saying this because I'm so wise. I'm not a religious leader. I'm not a leader of anything. I'm only saying it from, in my lifetime, I have been stunned by the people who have come to me, who by anyone else's measure would have sublime, perfect, beautiful, privileged lives, power, security, titles, and yet they themselves will say that there is something missing. And so I say to young people, make sure that you don't miss that essential element of being human.
Thank you. That's well said, well articulated. Please talk to us about how implementation of your work was 10 to 15 years ago compared to now. Do cover some of the challenges and how you have overcome them. And then we would like to hear the most highlight. I do know some of them you've shared before, but do share with our audience the highlights of your work so far. I know the best is yet to come and there's more to come, but do share the highlight as you tell us how implementation of your work was 10 to 15 years ago.
Well, what I would say is that, I think I started working at the foundation work when I was much younger, and younger than 40. And one of the things that I didn't know I had to learn was I learned from the African grandmothers. And my children grew up, Jackson, also thinking, understanding that the grandmothers of Africa who were raising millions of children orphaned by AIDS had a lifetime of experience that they were bringing to survival, to building resilience, to building their own organizations run by and for grandmothers, to participating in networks of thousands of grandmothers with NYACA, for instance, to not just to look after the children in their care, but the community of children that would be the future generations. And one of the things I learned was that, the whole concept of love as an engine of change, of social change, not just as a beautiful emotion, not just as something that fuels the human existence and human experience that's so essential to our well-being, but that love and consideration and respect and dignity at the center of these community initiatives, these community, these coming together in community to ensure the well-being and the future and the resilience of everyone involved, that these are essential dynamics, essential core motivators and drivers of social justice and change. Family connection. This is also part of what animates our best selves, what brings us together in community and what keeps us moving forward. And I learned a very deep and valuable lesson. I know it doesn't sound like an intellectual or a legal or a policy piece of learning, but it was a very deep and profound learning for me that the way the grandmothers talk about love is as an essential driving force of humanity, dignity, change, resilience, social justice. That was an important learning. So one of the things that I have done since I worked at the foundation with brilliant colleagues who taught me so much and took things so much further than I could ever have hoped to do or to see, as they continue to do now, after I've left, to take things in new chapters, new directions with so much vision and commitment. One of the things I continued to do, Jackson, was to try and amplify the voices and the expertise, the wisdom, the insights of older women, grandmothers and older women. So yes, you're right. I have a podcast where I interview older women who are doing everything from locking on to protest mines that are destroying the environment and climate justice activists to women who are fighting for reproductive, grandmothers and older women fighting for reproductive rights, to grandmothers and older women who are extraordinary artists who bring change and challenging norms through their extraordinary art all over the world. And that is a learning that I hope to continue to do. I think amplifying those voices and figuring out what intergenerational dialogue and sharing of wisdom and passion and inciting change and disrupting the oppression that exists in the world, that bringing older women in particular together with younger generations to share that drive, that passion, and those learnings, that knowledge is extraordinarily important to our well-being and the future of humanity. And so that's part of what I've committed myself to. So I just launched, this is a funny thing to say because it's not really my work in life, but during the pandemic, during the COVID pandemic, I was at home like so many others, locked down, and was able to be locked down, not have to travel. And I built a social media site for older women. It's called WizWork. You can find it at wizwork.net. Wiz like wisdom, but it's
WIZ.net.
.net. So it's WIZ or Z, WIZ.WIZ.WORK, WizWork, wisdom at work, WizWork.net. And that, who knows if that will be a useful, who knows if that will be a useful contribution. But the idea was to create a social media site where older women who are interested in social justice causes and want to connect across the world, very much inspired, I have to say, my inspiration coming from the African grandmothers who are at the heart of the response to HIV and AIDS in so many communities and families in Africa, and the Canadian grandmothers who came together in common cause and really have stood in solidarity with African grandmothers. They really inspired my whole life understanding of older women and the importance of them in our lives, not just as grandmothers to our children, not just as loving mothers for adult children like you and me, Jackson, but as essential agents of change, members of society that we must include, listen to, and heed. And so in anything I do and everywhere I go, this is as I devote myself to the life of human rights and women's rights activism and support and allyship, older women and their role and their voices and their expertise is always at my heart.
That's absolutely right and right on point. We thank you, Ilana, for making time to come here. We appreciate you sparing all this time to give to the world, to the young people, many of who you have raised, the children of Nyaka who listen to this. We all appreciate your advice and what you've shared. Please give your last remarks as we conclude. Thank you.
Well, Jackson, thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for your beautiful words. You have been my mentor and guide with so many of the grandmothers, 10,000 or more of them at NYACA and across the continent, hundreds of thousands of them. And I guess, I don't have final words. I guess what I would say is that my life has been so enriched by, I never go to bed at night thinking, is this all there is? I never go to bed at night thinking I don't feel fulfilled. My life has been filled with the extraordinary inspiration of the communities, the grandmothers around the world, and very much at the heart of the response to AIDS in Africa, but also by the men like you who are feminists, who have an organic sense of the importance of women, who saw that women were both the most infected, affected, and at the heart of the response. I've been inspired by so much of the work, and I feel like it is an extraordinary privilege in life to work with people who have so much courage, decency, vision, and resilience. So I would say to everyone who listens, you need to find out more about all of the work that NYACA has done. You need to find out more about the children and the grandmothers. You need to find out more about all of the community-based responses, if not just in this particular instance, but around the world, and really figure out how to plug in some part of your life to this essential life force, and devote part of your life, if you're not going to do all of it, devote part of your life to supporting that work. You will never regret it, and it will only enrich your existence on the planet. And in addition to that, it will inspire your own children, should you have them. It will inspire the children in your life, who will understand the fullness of, how to walk in the fullness of their potential as they watch you do so in your own. That's, it's not the words of wisdom. I'm not a grandmother yet. I can't be as wise as they are, but those are my last words, Jackson. And I thank you and everything you've ever done to educate me and to bring me into your world.